We like to believe that legends, those who reshape the world with their voices, their talent, their sheer presence, leave this life wrapped in glory, dignity, and reverence befitting their greatness. But reality can be far crueler than any Hollywood tragedy. Death does not always honor genius. Hard to imagine, right? Men who once commanded the brightest stages on earth ended their lives collapsed on filthy sidewalks, undone by something as absurd as a faulty air conditioner, a cheap plastic lighter, or even a stranger's forgotten piece of lingerie. Today, we're reopening the dark, shocking pages of history to uncover the 13 famous black figures whose deaths were among the most tragic and disturbingly ridiculous ever recorded. Join me as we unravel these endings that are both unbelievable and heartbreaking, and discover how, between the heights of fame and absolute oblivion, there can exist only a single careless moment. A wrongful death sparked by a forgotten piece of lingerie, and a life sentence paid by the wrong man. It was a March night in 1974 in Los Angeles when Harry Womack, a member of the Valentinos and the younger brother of the legendary Bobby Womack, met a fate no one could have imagined. This was not a gangland hit. Not a drug-fueled spiral, so common in that era's music scene. Harry died in the one place he should have been safest, his own apartment, all because of a single, misplaced item of women's underwear. That night, Harry returned home exhausted. Waiting for him was his girlfriend, Patricia, consumed by jealousy after discovering a pair of unfamiliar lace panties in the room. In a showbiz world poisoned by betrayal, she had no patience for explanations. The argument ignited fast, filling the cramped apartment with rage and accusation. In a moment of total loss of control, Patricia grabbed a kitchen knife and drove it straight into Harry's chest. The blade tore through his shirt, through his unfinished dreams, and ended the life of the man many called Harry Hippie. But the cruelest truth came later. According to Bobby Womack's own confession, the panties had nothing to do with Harry at all. They belonged to Bobby's girlfriend. Days earlier, Bobby and she had visited the apartment, and amid the careless chaos of non-stop partying, she had accidentally left them behind, forgotten on a sofa or wedged between cushions. Harry, the younger brother who lived in Bobby's shadow, ultimately took the knife for a sin he never committed. Harry Womack's death remains a chilling reminder of the dark underbelly of Hollywood's 1970s artist scene, where recklessness, jealousy, and neglect collided with fatal consequences. The older brother's carelessness and a woman's blind rage created a tragedy in which the most innocent person paid the highest price. Years later, when the song Harry Hippie became widely known, people sang along to its carefree melody, unaware that behind it lay a forensic file, a man brutally killed over a ridiculous misunderstanding. Mary, be careful of what you do, 'cause the life you lead, it's going to come back to you. In light of the truth, that lyric is no longer casual wisdom. It sounds like a bitter indictment. The loose lifestyle, the disregard for small responsibilities, eventually came back to haunt the family, but it was Harry who paid with his life. Ladies and gentlemen, is there a death more bitter than dying for someone else's negligence? And we must ask ourselves, could our own careless choices be silently digging graves for the people we love most? Little Walter, the legendary blues harp master, was silenced not by age or illness, but by a senseless street fight and one final, fatal sleep. If any man ever reshaped the blues with a harmonica small enough to fit in his pocket, it was Little Walter. In Chicago's golden era, he stood as the uncrowned king of chess records, the artist who turned a simple folk instrument into an electrified force that could shake a room. His sound changed blues forever. Yet that towering musical brilliance stood in painful contrast to the chaos of his private life. In February 1968, the world lost him not to a grand tragedy, but to his own unchecked temper. Walter lived hard, heavy drinking, constant conflict, and a hot-headed nature that flared at the slightest provocation. That night, during a break between sets at a Chicago club, instead of resting for the next performance, he drifted into a petty gambling dispute on the sidewalk outside. In the rough, low-rent music joints of the era, fights were common. But this one crossed a deadly line. Walter took a hard blow to the head. At just 37, seasoned by years of street scuffles, he brushed it off as nothing. He refused medical help, convinced it was only another bruise he'd sleep away. Rather than go to the hospital, he returned to his girlfriend's apartment on South Bennett Avenue and went to bed, trusting morning would erase the pain. It never did. While he slept, a blood clot formed in his skull, triggering coronary thrombosis, a silent consequence of that single punch. By morning, little Walter was gone. The king of the harmonica died quietly in a borrowed bed, his future unfinished, his music plans left hanging in the air. His death remains one of the blues' cruelest losses, a brutal reminder of the dangerous street life that trapped so many black artists of his generation. He survived prejudice, poverty, and countless nights on stage, only to fall over a dispute not worth a dime. Fans still marvel at Juke, but few remember that the hands which made history were the same fists drawn into a meaningless fight. Walter left no final words behind. Only the echo of his harmonica still seems to drift through the cold Chicago wind, whispering a hard truth. Fame can lift a man to mythic heights, but anger and complacency can bring him crashing down in an instant. Roger Troutman, a funk legend whose anthem was silenced by the darkest side of family loyalty. If there was one sound that electrified the pulse of 90s West Coast hip-hop, it was Roger Troutman's unmistakable robotic talkbox, smooth, futuristic, and instantly recognizable. From the infectious grooves of Zapp to the cultural earthquake of California love with Tupac Shakur, Roger wasn't just a performer, he was a sonic architect who reinvented funk for a new generation. His music made the world move, smile, and feel alive. But behind those radiant melodies lived a nightmare no fan could have imagined. On the morning of April 25, 1999, in Dayton, Ohio, the glittering Troutman empire collapsed in the most brutal way possible. Roger was found outside his recording studio, his body torn by multiple gunshot wounds. Rushed to the hospital, the king of funk fought for his life, but died on the operating table. Hours later, police made an even more devastating discovery. The body of Larry Troutman, Roger's own brother and longtime manager, slumped in a car nearby, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Authorities quickly ruled the tragedy a murder-suicide. Two brothers. One dream. One catastrophic end. The motive wasn't fame, jealousy, or the usual Hollywood drama. It was shattered trust and crushing financial pressure. Larry, once the backbone of the family business, was facing mounting debt and the collapse of their company, locked in bitter money disputes with the very brother he had helped guide to stardom. In the Troutman world, family and business had fused into something volatile, until resentment finally detonated. The studio that should have been a sanctuary for creativity became a crime scene, and a musical genius was lost forever. Roger Troutman's death is a chilling reminder of how money and mismanagement can poison even the closest bonds, turning blood into enemies. And when the music fades, we're left with an unsettling question. Was it ever worth it? How many homes, how many lives, must be destroyed before we learn that fame and fortune are no match for the cost of losing family? James Booker. James Booker was an unfinished sonata, silenced in a hospital wheelchair. In a music world crowded with loud legends and oversized egos, he stood utterly alone, brilliant, strange, and impossible to imitate. Dubbed the Black Liberace of New Orleans, Booker was a piano alchemist, bending jazz, blues, gospel, and classical into something supernatural. His fingers didn't just play notes, they summoned storms. Openly gay in an unforgiving era, a black man wearing a glittering, star-studded eye patch while battling relentless addiction, Booker embodied both defiance and raw genius. He was unforgettable on stage, invisible off it. The truth of his death is not merely tragic, it is an indictment of indifference. On a November afternoon in 1983, James Booker was rushed to Charity Hospital in New Orleans, his body already failing him. This was no private sanctuary for the rich or famous. It was a public hospital, strained and overcrowded, built to absorb the city's poorest and most forgotten. In that place, genius meant nothing. Talent meant nothing. All that remained on paper was a black man, an addict, an alcoholic. To the staff that day, James Booker was not a legend. He was processed, categorized, dismissed. Instead of urgent care, he was parked in a battered wheelchair and left in the suffocating chaos of the waiting room. There he sat, head slumped, breath shallow, surrounded by noise, antiseptic fumes, and human exhaustion. No one recognized the Bayou Maharaja. No one realized the man gasping for life had once mesmerized the world's greatest stages. James Booker died right there, in that chair, alone in the middle of a crowd, before a doctor ever touched his wrist. His death was not a simple medical failure. It exposed a brutal, unspoken rule of 1980s America. Once the spotlight fades, your worth is judged by your scars. To that system, a poor, gay black man reeking of alcohol and drugs did not deserve urgency, no matter how divine his music once was. Inside the peeling walls of Charity Hospital, fame dissolved. Admiration evaporated. What remained was silent discrimination. They let a genius die like a nobody. Not because they couldn't save him, but because they didn't think he was worth saving. James Booker didn't die for music. He died of poverty. He died because addiction erased his humanity in the eyes of the system. And his final image is not the dazzling showman behind a piano. It is a frail body slumped in a wheelchair, surrounded by chemical smells and the cold indifference of the world he once made beautiful. Don Myrick, a saxophone legend whose music echoed through generations, silenced forever by a fatal misunderstanding involving something as trivial as a lighter. In the world of funk and soul, Don Myrick was more than a name. He was a sound, a pulse, a breath of gold flowing through the saxophone. As the heartbeat of the iconic Phoenix horns, he helped shape the unmistakable brilliance of earth, wind, and fire, and etched his legacy into pop history with that aching, unforgettable solo in Phil Collins' hit, One More Night. But all that brilliance was violently extinguished on a quiet summer morning in Los Angeles in 1993. Not by age, not by illness, but by a single, irreversible mistake made in fear. The scene played out like a grim crime thriller. Los Angeles police officers burst into Myrick's apartment in the Palms district to execute a search warrant over suspected drug possession. Inside the dim, early morning silence of his own home, Don Myrick held a long-barreled butane lighter, the kind used to light candles or a gas stove. Startled by strangers crashing through his door, he instinctively raised the lighter to see who was there. In that split second, through the tense and prejudiced eyes of Officer Gary, the harmless plastic object became a gun. One shot rang out. The silence shattered. Don Myrick fell to the floor of his own apartment, blood soaking his nightclothes, the lighter still clenched in his hand. The irony is unbearable. A man who spent his life lifting a golden saxophone, using nothing but breath to soothe the souls of millions, lost his life because of a cheap butane lighter worth less than $2. The raid yielded no drugs, no weapons, no victory. The only thing seized that morning was the life of one of the greatest musicians of his generation. This was not just a tragedy. It was a grotesque absurdity. A moment where the line between a household tool and a deadly weapon proved thinner than fear itself. A black legend died because of a mistake so senseless it feels unreal, yet the consequences were final. Don Myrick's story did not end with a Lifetime Achievement Award, but with a prolonged lawsuit between his family and the city of Los Angeles. The eventual multi-million-dollar settlement could never replace what was lost. No amount of money could fill the silence left behind by that saxophone. The naked truth is this: in the shadows of a police raid, fame, talent, and global recognition offer no shield. When suspicion overwhelms reason, even a musical genius can become a target. Listen again to the words Phil Collins sang in One More Night, carried by Myrick's haunting solo. Like a river to the ocean, I will always keep coming back to you. After that night, those lyrics taste bitter. He was home, exactly where he belonged. Yet he never returned, to music, to family, to life. Now, when that saxophone cries through the song, it no longer sounds like romance. It sounds like a ghost. A reminder of a cruel reality where a black man's life can be erased in seconds by a frightened reflex in the dark. This is more than a scar on Hollywood history. It is proof that even the greatest lives can be wiped out in an instant. By fear, by error, by something as painfully ordinary as a lighter. Johnny Ace. Johnny Ace. A single shot on Christmas Eve sealed the cruelest joke ever played on the Prince of R&B. On the night of December 24, 1954, while millions were slow dancing to the velvet sorrow of Pledging My Love, tragedy crept in backstage at Houston's City Auditorium. Johnny Ace, handsome, adored, and crowned the Prince of R&B, was dead at just 25. Not by an enemy's hand. Not by a crash or a brawl. But by a reckless moment, a stupid dare with a pistol at the very peak of his fame. Backstage should have been buzzing with victory. The show had soared. Laughter bounced off the walls, cheap whiskey hung in the air, and success felt intoxicating. Somewhere between the jokes and the applause, Johnny pulled out a .22 revolver. It wasn't meant as a threat. In that era, some artists treated guns like props, dangerous toys used to show nerve, bravado, manhood. With friends watching, including blues legend Big Mama Thornton, Johnny spun the cylinder. Smiling. Laughing. He lifted the barrel to his temple and brushed off their concern with words that would echo forever. It's okay. The gun's not loaded. See? But death doesn't respect talent, youth, or fame. It waits quietly. Inside the chamber Johnny trusted to be empty, a single bullet remained, silent and patient, like a snake beneath dry leaves. The crack of the gunshot ripped through the dressing room. In an instant, the light vanished from Johnny Ace's eyes. He crumpled to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut, collapsing among sequined costumes and makeup dust, turning a Christmas celebration into a blood-stained nightmare. Faces froze in horror. Moments earlier, they had been drinking with a star. Now they were staring at the end of a genius who had just erased his own future with one careless gesture. It was a death so senseless it bordered on the absurd. A man who held the world in his hands gambled everything on an empty chamber, and lost it all before the laughter even left his lips. Shorty Long. Within Motown's glittering 1960s dynasty, Shorty Long stood out as a rare, unmistakable talent. He wasn't just a singer or a songwriter, he was a true musical craftsman, a producer and multi-instrumentalist who moved effortlessly from piano to harmonica with dazzling skill. With hits like Here Comes the Judge, he was poised on the edge of soul music immortality, a rising force destined to leave a permanent mark on Motown's future. But his ascent was cut short in the most literal and tragic way imaginable. On a quiet June evening in 1969, not by scandal, illness, or the slow fading of fame, but by a senseless act of maritime negligence. That night, Shorty Long and a friend drifted along the Detroit River in a small boat beneath the muted glow of the Motor City's moonlight, what should have been a calm escape after long studio hours. In a brief lapse of awareness, perhaps fueled by comfort or overconfidence on open water, their boat drifted into the path of a towering freighter. The collision was merciless, pure physics at work. The small vessel crumpled like a toy beneath the crushing weight of thousands of tons of steel. Thrown into the icy river, Shorty Long never resurfaced to breathe Detroit's air again. The shock of his death was as brutal as it was absurd. A man who could master intricate melodies and complex arrangements lost his life to a simple, avoidable mistake. He didn't fall to disease or the ruthless politics of show business. He died during a moment of leisure, from an error more fitting of reckless amateurs than a star carrying Motown's promise into the future. Shorty Long's death feels like a song reaching its most powerful crescendo, only for a string to snap without warning, leaving behind an echoing, devastating silence. There was no grandeur in the wreckage scattered beneath the freighter's hull, only the unbearable cost of a single careless moment on the water. Frankie Lyman. Frankie Lyman. A shocking overdose on a decaying bathroom floor, the brutal fate of a teen idol consumed by his own legend. In the 1950s, Frankie Lyman embodied the purest glow of American music. With Why Do Fools Fall in Love, the 13-year-old with the sky-high voice and radiant smile became the first black teen idol, captivating a nation and forcing the world to take notice. But that blinding halo was only the opening act of a long, unforgiving fall. In February 1968, the world learned that Frankie was gone at just 25 years old. There were no spotlights, no screaming fans, only a cold bathroom floor in his grandmother's modest Harlem home. It was a scene so stark it felt unreal. After circling the globe, savoring both the sweetness of fame and the sting of rejection, Frankie returned to where it all began to take his final breath. Fate's irony cut deep. His death came just days after he had signed a new recording contract, a rare second chance to reclaim his life and outrun his addiction. Instead of celebrating with music, Frankie celebrated with heroin, believing it would give him one last lift before a new beginning. The image left behind is devastating in its contrast: a once brilliant star, crumpled on a rotting floor, a spent syringe nearby. No conspiracy, no industry pressure in that final moment. Just a lonely overdose, unnoticed until his body had gone cold, in the one place he should have felt safe. Frankie Lyman did not die for art. He fell to a single, fatal choice made at the very edge of redemption. His story stands as a chilling indictment of an industry that elevates children to the heavens, then abandons them when their voices change. And it breaks the heart to watch old footage, the wide-eyed boy with an angel's voice, knowing that the child who once sang of love grew up only to walk into a trap with no way out. King Curtis. King Curtis. The blazing saxophone silenced beside an air conditioner and a senseless argument. Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever wondered how something so painfully ordinary, an appliance meant to bring relief, could become the final chapter in the life of a legend? In the world of soul and R&B, King Curtis's horn was the heartbeat. It breathed fire into Aretha Franklin's respect and powered countless classics of an era. With hands that could make cold brass cry or laugh, Curtis stood at the summit of American music, a true king crowned by sound. Yet on a sweltering August night in 1971, his reign was cut short, not by excess, not by scandal, but by a moment so banal it feels cruel. New York was locked in a brutal heatwave, the kind that frays nerves and thickens the air. Curtis came home late, exhausted, hauling an air conditioner up to his building, chasing a little cool in the suffocating city. At his doorway, two addicts loitered, blocking the path. Words were exchanged. Tempers flared. What should have ended as a minor dispute escalated in seconds. A knife flashed. The blade went straight into the chest of a man who had conquered the world's greatest stages. The truth is almost unbearable in its starkness. A man named King drew his final breath on a dusty New York sidewalk over a blocked walkway and a burst of anger. The knife didn't just pierce his body, it pierced the absurdity of fate itself. King Curtis didn't die because he was reckless. He died because he was home at the wrong moment, colliding with a society scarred by violence and addiction. There is a tragic, almost surreal irony in how fate arranged his end. It reminds us that fame and genius offer no armor against the lethal randomness of everyday life. We still hear his horn, bold, defiant, dignified, echoing through history. Yet his own finale held none of that grandeur. He fell beside the very machine meant to cool the night, leaving behind a silence that can never be filled. Darryl Banks. Darryl Banks. A gunshot mistaken for justice, and the eternal silence of a lost romantic. In the chronicles of soul music, Darryl Banks arrived like a sudden thunderclap, raw, powerful, and full of promise, only to vanish just as the sky began to glow. With "Open the Door to Your Heart," he flung himself into the spotlight, hailed by critics as the next Otis Redding, a voice destined for greatness. But in February 1970, on a frozen Detroit street, that door was slammed shut forever. Banks' end was born from a volatile mix of jealousy, heartbreak, and a fatal misunderstanding, where love, possession, and the cold barrel of authority collided. It began not beneath stage lights, but on a gray, snow-dusted sidewalk. Darryl went looking for his ex-lover, hoping to confront the wreckage of a failed romance. Instead, fate placed a deadly obstacle in his path. The man standing there was not just a romantic rival, but Erin Bullock, her new partner, and an off-duty police officer carrying a hidden gun. Consumed by rejection and wounded pride, Darryl made the most tragic gamble of his life. Believing he faced only another man, he stepped forward to settle things with anger and fists. What he didn't see was the full weight of the legal system disguised in plain clothes. In that instant, It ceased to be a fight between two men and became a fatal crossing of a line no emotion can survive. A lovesick artist, blinded by feeling, ran headlong into a power that offers no mercy when passion overrides reason. The moment unraveled as quickly and mercilessly as Detroit's winter hardens the ground. In the chaos of the confrontation, ego eclipsed judgment. Bullock drew his weapon. There was no pause, no second chance. The shot cut through the icy air and tore into Darrell's chest, ending his life at the very place he had come only to release his pain. The cruelest truth revealed itself after the echo faded. As Darrell Banks lay lifeless on the pavement, the machinery of justice moved on without hesitation. Justifiable homicide. On paper, the officer was cleared. But for the music world, it was an execution of potential, an irreplaceable voice erased with no appeal. The law may find logic in the trigger pull, but there is no logic that can replace a silenced legend. Darrell Banks went there trying to pry open the locked door of a former lover's heart. Instead, he unknowingly walked through the door of death. His greatest mistake was not love itself, but the illusion that fame or talent could shield him from reality's cold steel. He entered an emotional battle with the instincts of an artist, and was crushed by a system that has no room for blind passion. Friends, the death of Darrell Banks remains a painfully off-key note in the symphony of soul music. It reminds us that no matter how bright the spotlight shines, it cannot protect a man from the storms of his own heart. Lee Morgan. A night of jazz drowned in blood, a blizzard, and a final shot fired by the one who once saved him. On the night of February 19, 1972, Slug's Saloon in New York City pulsed with cigarette smoke, clinking glasses, and the hypnotic warmth of live jazz. On stage stood Lee Morgan, only 33 years old, already a trumpet legend, blazing with talent, freshly clawed back from the abyss of heroin addiction. His horns sang with renewed fire, proof that genius, once reclaimed, could burn even brighter. But just beyond the glow of the stage lights, something darker was waiting. During a break between sets, a heated argument exploded backstage between Lee and Helen Morgan, the woman who had stood beside him through poverty, addiction, and near self-destruction. Words cut deep. Tempers flared. When Lee ordered Helen to leave the club, the dismissal struck like a final betrayal. She stormed out into the freezing night, but she didn't stay gone. Minutes later, Helen returned, this time with a revolver hidden beneath her coat. As laughter and idle chatter filled the room, she moved through the crowd with chilling purpose. Her eyes locked onto the man on stage, the man she loved, the man she had saved. "You think you can live without me, Lee?" she demanded, her voice trembling between heartbreak and fury. Then, without another word, she pulled the trigger. The shot tore through the music. The bullet slammed into Lee Morgan's chest, cutting him down at the very spot where he had just been soaring. But the true horror of that night did not end with the gunshot. It began there. Lee collapsed onto the cold wooden floor as blood poured from the wound, soaking through his performance shirt. Outside, a savage blizzard swallowed New York whole, burying the streets in white and grinding the city to a standstill. Inside the club, chaos erupted. Lee stared up at Helen, his breath ragged, confusion and disbelief clouding his eyes. "Helen, why?" he whispered. The gun slipped from her hand. Reality crashed down. Helen fell beside him, suddenly aware of the madness she had unleashed. She cradled his body, pressing her hands against his chest in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. "Don't go, Lee," she sobbed. "Please, don't leave me." For more than an hour, death arrived slowly and mercilessly. Calls for help went unanswered by fate. An ambulance screamed through the snow, but it never made it. The blizzard had sealed every road, trapping rescue just minutes away and yet impossibly distant. Lee Morgan did not die instantly. He remained conscious, feeling the life drain from his body inch by inch, the cold creeping upward as his blood pooled beneath him. He lay there, held by the same woman who had once been his only lifeline, and was now his executioner. The irony is almost unbearable. Helen Morgan had once pawned her own coat to buy Lee a trumpet when addiction had stripped him of everything. That same hand, which once saved his music, now silenced it forever. As the snow piled against the windows, the brilliant sound of jazz faded into a terrifying stillness. Lee Morgan drew his final breath in the arms of the woman who loved him enough to save him, and hated him enough to destroy him. He did not die because his wound was untreatable. He died because of time, because of snow, because modern medicine stood just minutes away, unreachable. The trumpet that once shook the world fell silent, leaving only the howl of a New York winter to mourn a life rescued and erased by the very same hand. Rudy Lewis. Rudy Lewis died alone in a quiet New York hotel room, after a feast, on the eve of glory, with one voice painfully missing from history's most important moment. On the night of May 20, 1964, in a cramped, anonymous hotel room, the lead singer of the Drifters lay motionless on crisp white sheets. He was only 27 years old, standing at the absolute peak of his career. His voice, silky, aching, unforgettable, had helped define the sound of a generation. And yet, his death arrived not with drama or violence, but with a cruel, almost absurd irony. After an excessively heavy dinner, his body failed him, overwhelmed by a lethal combination of asphyxiation and drug overdose. No spotlight, no applause, no farewell, just silence. Rudy Lewis died alone in bed, taken by a cause so ordinary it feels unreal, gone not by fate's grand design, but by a mundane physical misstep on the night before his greatest triumph. The next morning, New York awoke beneath a rising sun, buzzing with anticipation. It was a landmark day for the Drifters. In the studio, the microphones were set, the tape machines rolled, and history waited to be recorded. But Rudy never arrived. The center space stood empty, unbearably so. While his body lay cold behind 4 hotel walls, his bandmates swallowed their grief and stepped up to the mic to record under the boardwalk. Their voices echoed through lifeless equipment, straining to fill the space where Rudy should have been. The song flowed on, smooth, joyful, timeless, masking the hollow absence of the man who had died only hours earlier, just short of immortality. The cruelest irony came afterward. Under the Boardwalk, recorded on the very morning of Rudy Lewis's death, became a massive hit, an enduring anthem of American music, topping charts and winning hearts across the world. Millions fell in love with its warmth, never knowing that its success was built upon loss, that its brilliance carried the ghost of the voice that was meant to lead it. Rudy Lewis left this world on the brink of forever. His absence became the song's quiet wound, a dull ache beneath the happy melody. The final image of his life is a brutal contrast. A dark hotel room where a gifted soul died for reasons tragically foolish, and a brightly lit studio where grieving men sang of joy they no longer felt. Rudy Lewis died both tragically and absurdly, leaving behind a legacy he never lived to hear, becoming, perhaps, the most famous missing voice in the history of soul and jazz. Jesse Belvin. A slashed tire. A shattered Cadillac. And the sudden end of a man who dared to believe music could heal a divided nation. On the night of February 6, 1960, in Arkansas, Jesse Belvin, celebrated as a rare bridge between R&B and pop, slid behind the wheel of his 1959 Cadillac carrying both pride and unease. Just hours earlier, he had made history in Little Rock, performing at the city's first fully integrated concert, where black and white audiences sat side by side, united by song. It was a moment of hope. But in the racially volatile South of that era, hope came at a dangerous price. Backstage, death threats lingered in the air. Belvin heard them. He felt them. Yet he chose grace over fear, smiling as he slipped quietly into the night, bound for his next show. He never made it. On Hope Highway, tragedy struck. The Cadillac suddenly veered out of control, colliding head-on with an oncoming vehicle in a violent crash. Steel twisted. Glass exploded. When the wreckage settled, Jesse Belvin and his wife lay buried beneath blood and mangled metal. Investigators later discovered deep, deliberate gashes in the tires, cuts that pointed toward sabotage and possibly assassination by racist extremists enraged by his message of unity. Official reports, however, told a murkier story. The driver was exhausted after days of non-stop travel. The road itself was infamous. Poor visibility, sharp turns, little margin for error. Mechanical failure and human fatigue created the perfect fog of doubt, making it nearly impossible to prove in court that Belvin's death was anything more than a tragic accident. Yet when viewed against the backdrop of an America soaked in racial hatred and violence, the accident explanation feels painfully thin. The cruel irony is impossible to ignore. Jesse Belvin devoted his life to easing racial wounds through music, and that very courage may have sealed his fate. He did not simply die in a car crash. He died because he challenged a poisonous system built on fear and division. If the tire cuts were real, this was a cowardly execution. And if they were not, then fate itself dealt a merciless blow to a messenger of peace. Together, we have walked through some of the darkest chapters in American music history, where brilliance and brutality existed just inches apart. These stories are heartbreaking, but they remind us how fragile life truly is and how dangerous it once was to stand for justice. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with us. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the untold, hidden stories of legendary Black stars whose truths were never fully revealed.